What's shaking, everyone? So this is a new series I want to start. I want to take a look back at some of the most unheralded great teams of all time, and I think the 76 Oakland Raiders are a great place to start. Now, if you've watched my channel for any modicum of time, you know that the Baltimore Ravens are my favorite football team, but my 1A is definitely the Oakland Raiders. It was drilled into me as a young kid, and hey, I've kept the fandom alive as well. It's been tough to watch in the past couple of decades. Ugh. But man, you take a look back at those old 70s Raiders teams, those 70s Steelers teams, and that's when football was real and it fucking ruled. I go back and consistently watch some of those old tapes, and man, any of those teams from the 70s and the 80s, they could come in and slot in perfectly today. Now, they'd probably get penalized out the asshole, but that's neither here nor there. Those teams were tremendously talented, and as we'll discuss here today, man, the 76 Raiders just don't get talked about enough because they were always in contention, and they set the standard for, well, realistically, culture itself for the following 20 years. But before we dig too far into that, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to watch these videos. I put a lot of work into everything that I upload here, and man, the support has been terrific here lately. So if there's a topic, if there's a team that you'd like for me to cover, if there is anything that's going on in the world today that you'd like for me to take a deeper look at, feel free to drop it in that comment section down below. As well, when you're down there, hey, if you want to hit that subscribe button, and hey, you're going to be getting 2 videos a day at least, and on a variety of different issues. And this is just something new we're going to be trying, and if you appreciate that, feel free to hit that like button. That's more like it. Feel free to hit that like button because that does a tremendous amount to get that channel, or get this channel out there to more people if you like what I am doing. Anyways, let's go right into this. The 76 Raiders were full of Hall of Famers, badasses, and guys who should be Hall of Famers. I'll just give a rundown of what the roster looked like. You have Ken Stabler, who finally got into the Hall of Fame after way too long of a wait, in my opinion. There is no more overlooked successful quarterback in history than Ken Stabler. The man had the prototypical arm that you look for today in a quarterback. The man was brutally accurate deep, and he never gets talked about enough. Probably because he was, well, a product of the University of Alabama, he was the successor to one Joe Namath, and they kind of shared the same sort of personality. So especially when you were a Raider around that time, you had a, certain reputation that precedes you. And then, of course, yeah, just a really solid running back crew, and Clarence Davis and Mark Van Egan. Guys who could catch and who could block and really could do it all. Even though rushing at that point for the Raiders wasn't as important as a strong defense and Ken Stabler's arm. And then, of course, you have the reason Stickham's been banned, Fred Biletnikoff, who everybody will point to his use of Stickham and excessive padding as a reason why he was successful. But the man was fucking good at what he did. He could run a pattern like nobody else at that time. And the Stickham helped mostly because he was brutally insecure off field. He would constantly worry about every single game, and he would smoke 2 packs a day. And a guy who can run like that for the entirety of a football game, it's fucking bonkers to even think that. But he'd smoke 2 packs before the game. He'd have one just before going out onto the field, and he'd also throw up before every single game. He was a total wreck, but he's a Hall of Fame wide receiver. And then Cliff Branch is, I don't know how the man's not in the Hall of Fame. Prototypical speed guy. In 76, it was completely unheard for somebody to be that fast and that efficient. He'd be like if you put DeAndre Hopkins in time. Not quite as big, but a man who is just a transcendent route runner and the fastest human being alive at that point. And it's kind of bears repeating. It's another prototypical person that could slot right in at the tight end position. Dave Casper. The man is everything that Jimmy Graham tries to be. Everything that you want a modern day tight end to be. The guy could block, the guy could run routes. He was a reliable target. He fucking covered up for anything underneath that Ken Stabler couldn't hit long. Casper was right there, and hey, it's a reason why he's totally in the Hall of Fame. But what made all of this possible for the Raiders is, well, the left side of their offensive line and Gene Upshaw and Art Shell. You put those guys out there today, and you think Jadeveon Clowney's making that corner on the left side, not having Gene Upshaw or Art Shell stick a fucking forearm right in his face, knocking his helmet off? They would make every single defensive lineman cry. There's no two ways about it. Those were two of the best offensive linemen of all time, and the fact that they were both on the same team in their prime at the same time just goes to show you how great the Raiders were in the 70s. They made it to the AFC Championship game 6 of the preceding 7 years in 1976, and the AFC at this point was stacked with the Baltimore Colts, a little team that went undefeated in 72, the Miami Dolphins, and the Pittsburgh Steelers. The fucking AFC was jacked, and throughout the entire 70s, those three teams, the Raiders and the Dallas Cowboys, were the only teams to win Super Bowls in the 70s, and they all just kept fighting over top of each other, including on the NFC side, you have to throw in the Purple People Eaters, who, spoiler, I know, for a fucking 44-year-old retrospective, Raiders had to beat in order to win the Super Bowl in 76. There was a ridiculous amount of talent in the NFL in 76. Well, throughout the entire 70s, rather. But what made the Raiders actually scary was their defense. Instead of going down one after another, just John Matuzak, Phil Villapiano, Old Man Willie Brown, George Atkinson, Jack Tatum, just total savages. Like, the assassin, George Atkinson, you probably know him from paralyzing Darryl Stingley, but in the first game of the 76 season, I know we're jumping ahead here, the Raiders were so sick of the Steelers. On the first offensive play of the game, George Atkinson lays out Lynn Swann, who's not even in the play, with a fucking forearm just to set the tenor for the 76 season that, hey, guess what? We're here and we're fucking winning this year. We're no more of this steel curtain shit. We are here. Absolute savages on defense that I can't believe most of these guys aren't in the Hall of Fame. Matuzak was a fucking criminal. And that's what Chuck Noll said. The Raiders and the Steelers have a criminal element to them. And that's what made the NFL so wildly successful. And when I said in the intro of the video that the Raiders really shaped society in the next, few decades, you take a look at the counterculture in the 1990s when all of the kids that were watching the NFL at this point, they were mere toddlers watching the NFL, and the Raiders were front and center there. They were the tastemakers. They were all of those big characters. Everybody had a nickname. You had the Snake, Ken Stabler, the Ghost, the Assassin, Old Man Willie. That was not commonplace. Like, the Steelers had Mean Joe Green, but the Raiders really made their mark on society that once those kids that were watching these teams grew up in the 90s, created that counterculture, and you never would have got that raw, aggressive attitude had it not been for the Raiders. You wouldn't have got NWA cranking out the best gangster rap album of all time, Straight Outta Compton, rocking the fucking Raiders gear, had they not been badasses when Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, all of them were watching Raiders games. So let's run down the 76 season. We'll just glance over most of the highlights here. So in week 1, as if things could not start off on a tougher foot for the Raiders, they had to go up against the world championship defending Pittsburgh Steelers, and they beat them. They set the tone. Like I said, first play of the game, George Atkinson, bam, forearm Lynn Swann, and that set the tone. And then keep going ahead, and the first game that they lost was week 4. The only game that they lost in the 76 season was to the New England Patriots, which for Raider aficionados really sucks because the Patriots have always been a thorn in the Raiders' side. Like, jump ahead to the future in 2000, you got the Tuck Rule game with Tom Brady, and even though they've never consistently crossed paths, it's always competitive atmosphere between the two teams, and a stark contrast between the badasses out west and the goody two-shoes in Boston. And then week 5, the strangest and probably the most hilarious statistic that would come out of the 10-point victory against the Chargers was they had, I actually have the stats pulled up here. Yeah, the Raiders had 153 rushing yards. And like I said when I introed all the players, rushing wasn't their main highlight for the game. It was mostly to set up the pass. They had 153 rushing yards that game, and they had more penalty yards than they had rushing yards. But hey, they managed to win by 10 points. The next notable game was week 9 at Chicago and at Soldier Field, where it was a nail-biter. The Raiders consistently scored, and the Bears had a huge third quarter. And as it says here, Oakland escaped Chicago with a victory after a 31-yard field goal attempt by Bob Thomas with 15 seconds left that got caught in a gust of wind and hit the upright. That doesn't tell the entire story because the Raiders put up a good fight throughout the entire game. Okay, I got the stats for the game, obviously. Like, it was competitive, and the Chicago Bears fielded a very good team that year. Like, the Raiders put up 322 yards of offense and gave up 365 yards of offense. It was competitive. The score shows that, but to just write it off as a last-second field goal doesn't tell the entire story of the game. Sorry. And then week 13 is the last notable regular season game that was played. Now, if the Raiders beat the Bengals, the Steelers would get into the playoffs. And if we all know the heated rivalry between the Steelers and the Raiders in the 70s, it bears no importance in repeating. But the Bengals also made it to the AFC Championship previously in the 70s. That was a really good team, and had they beaten the Raiders, they would have made it into the playoffs as well. Now, a lot of people speculated that the Bengals would have been an easier target for the Raiders in the playoffs, and they should consider, I don't know, taking the week off. But that wasn't those badasses' opinion at the time. I didn't mention them up to this point, and perhaps that's maybe by design, but John Madden was the head coach. Yes, kids, if there's any of you watching out there, he's not just the man who has his name on the popular video game series. I couldn't sound older with that description, but he was also a intensely influential head coach in the NFL, a Super Bowl winning head coach, but he was a master at knowing how to delegate responsibility. For the 76 season, Ken Stabler took over as being the play caller for the offense, and that's because he had trust in his leaders. He had a ridiculously talented coaching staff, John Madden did, and he knew how to surround his team with great minds who could get the job done. John Madden was the foundational player's head coach. You hear that thrown around a lot today, and a player's head coach really makes you think of a pushover head coach, kind of like Steve Kerr for the Golden State Warriors. It's just a man who doesn't really inspire confidence, is just mostly there to be a sounding board and just kind of lets the boys play. But John Madden would step in when necessary. He would back off, but he would still respect his leaders enough to lead, but would step in when necessary. Madden gets a lot of credit for revolutionizing the head coaching position. Nowadays, he mostly gets talked about for being the namesake for a football game franchise and for very quotable game day analysis. Like, he didn't spend a long time being a head coach, but he accomplished a lot in a short period of time and was instrumental in the Raiders' success in the mid-70s and early 70s. So realistically, week 13 is when the season wrapped up for him because they absolutely shellacked the San Diego Chargers, like 24-0. Just, it was, most of the starters were out and more or less just a walk in the park, really. So then we got the playoffs, and like I mentioned earlier, the AFC was a total fucking meat grinder. And in the divisional round, the Raiders had to face the only team that beat them in 76, the New England Patriots. And you can see the box score over here on the side. The Raiders had to come back in the fourth quarter in order to, advance to the championship game and face, their vaunted rivals in the Steelers. It was very important that the Raiders lost that one game against the Patriots because it proved that just because you can beat the defending Super Bowl champions in week 1 doesn't mean you are invincible. Just because you beat the top dog doesn't mean somebody can or can't knock you off your post. That's why there's only been one undefeated team And that's because they had absolute workhorses and a head coach that, I don't know if you can chalk it up to leadership or the fact that he was the head of the safety council for the NFL. But regardless, there's only been one undefeated team, and that's for good reason. Now, Pittsburgh Steelers apologists and for the 76 season tend to look at the AFC Championship game as one of those, oh, we weren't at our best, because their top two running backs, Franco Harris and Rocky Bleier, were both injured and out of the game. But you still have Lynn Swann, John Stallworth, Terry Bradshaw. You have the entire Steel Curtain with Jack Lambert, Jack Ham, Mel Blount, Mean Joe Green. You had all of those savages still there. So if you're going to make excuses because your two running backs aren't there, Terry Bradshaw is another guy who does not get near enough credit for piloting 4 championship teams, because he had a fucking arm on him too that is brutally underrated, and a football IQ that is very rarely been matched by anyone in the game. So piss and moan all you like, but the Raiders absolutely skunked them in the championship game 24-7. But next year the Steelers would win a championship again, so who gives a shit? Sorry, 2 years later. My bad. Cowboys would win next year. So finally, after all of those years of heartbreaking losses in AFC Championship games, the Raiders finally make it to the Super Bowl, and they have to face the Purple People Eaters, probably the best team in the NFC. I'd listen to arguments for the Cowboys at that time, but yeah, Minnesota was nothing to slouch at. I've got their starter page pulled up. You had Fran Tarkenton, Sammy White, Ron Yeri, and Ed White on defense, or on the offensive line rather, and then on defense, Alan Page, Jim Marshall, Jeff Simeon, Nate Allen, Nate Wright. The fucking Purple People Eaters are vaunted for a reason. And Fran Tarkenton is the quarterback everybody is looking for nowadays. He was Michael Vick 1.0 with a better arm. So this was not a foregone conclusion just because the Raiders got by the Steelers in the AFC Championship game. But to be completely honest, the game was anything but competitive. In the first, well, you see the box score over there on the right-hand side of the screen. After the first quarter, when they were done feeling each other out, yeah, the Raiders just went on a unstoppable rampage because Fran Tarkenton, all of his weapons were neutralized by Atkinson and Tatum and Brown. And that's where you get the classic shot of Old Man Willie running down the sidelines with the interception, going 75 yards to score a pick six. It was a cathartic win for the Raiders because it finally justified all of that struggle, all of those little tweaks that at the time, Al Davis, there was nobody sharper when it came to putting together a team full of recycled parts and cast-offs, because John Matuzak, as great as he was for the Raiders, he was previously cut by 3 other teams. And could you imagine that psychopath on any other team? George Atkinson laying motherfuckers out, being accepted at that time by any other team. I know he'd go on to play for the Patriots, and he went on to play for the Denver Broncos. I'm getting him mixed up with his counterpart and Willie Brown, who came over from the Patriots. My mistake. At that point, Al Davis was one of the sharpest minds in football. It's just unfortunate in his final years of running the Oakland Raiders organization, he drafted poorly, trying to reuse his old tactics of reclamation projects like Richard Seymour, who still had good years left in him. He was just woefully surrounded by athletes with no football IQ. And while that could work in the 70s, where you bring in, I don't think I'm being disparaging and saying criminals to your team and making them into good football players, instead he just bring in track athletes like Darius Hayward-Bay over drafting Michael Crabtree, which I think is one of the dumbest decisions he ever personally made. But at this point, Al Davis was still that loud leader who you seen on TV and wanted to emulate one day. And in fact, the Oakland Raiders at that point were the team that you wanted to emulate for reasons I already explained, because they were a bunch of hard-hitting savages, and I mean that with the utmost respect. Because just look at on this team, how many Hall of Famers you have. You have Al Davis, obviously, John Madden, Fred Biletnikoff, Old Man Willie Brown, Dave Casper, Ray Guy, who is still the greatest punter of all time, Ted Hendricks, Art Shell, Ken Stabler, Gene Upshaw. And then they'd later go on to add guys like Lyle Alzado. Jim Otto preceded this group, but he would have fit in right in. The Raiders still today have a mystique based on their actions of the 70s and 80s, and it's something that is desperately needed in football today. I couldn't imagine any of these teams from the 2000s or the 2010s dropping back into time into the 70s and 80s facing off against the Raiders, the Steelers, the Vikings, the Cowboys, the Niners in the 90s. They just couldn't hack it. And that's a goddamn shame because football was at its peak. Because, okay, we all know that the Super Bowl tends to be the most watched event of the year on TV. And like it says down here, okay, there were an estimated 62 million viewers. Now at the time, the population of the United States wasn't 360 million like it is right now, but it got a 44.4 share. I've got last year's Super Bowl pulled up just for comparison. Yeah, okay, they got 102 million people in the US average, 55.7 share in Kansas City, 48.6 in San Francisco, and they didn't even get the same national share. Football was never more popular than it was in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And to me, that's because, well, it has gotten soft. You bring back the hard-hitting action like they had in the 70s, and then you'd have all of these activists shutting the fuck up and hunkering down and making the game better. But that's just my opinion, and that's the first episode of looking back at underappreciated teams, and 1976's Oakland Raiders perfectly personifies the type of team I want to look back at. And we're going to be doing this across sports, so looking back at old MLB teams, NBA teams, and NHL teams too, because there are a lot of unsung great teams, and I feel like they deserve to be highlighted. And I think that's a perfect place to end today's video. I want to thank you all for taking the time to watch this, and I've been Khan Swaylo. I want you guys to follow your gut and get after it. Take care, everyone.